It's 3 a.m, baby. And you know what you should talk about at 3 a.m. on a Saturday night? You should start talking about the Brexit Windsor Framework, baby. It's the best time to start talking about the Brexit Windsor Framework. But you know who we've got to help us, talk us through it? Is the absolute goats at TLDR News. They're here to talk us through it. The Windsor Framework. Explain! Is this Brexit done?
Ever since he negotiated his much-touted Brexit deal in 2019, Boris Johnson and his successors have been trying to renegotiate the contentious Northern Ireland Protocol.
Yes.
But to no avail.
PDFs, baby. How many pages long was the Windsor Framework? 29 pages long, 2.49 megabytes, baby, of extremely exciting policy. But let's let TLDR break it down for us.
That was until yesterday, when after months of guarded negotiations, Rishi Sunak finally unveiled his much-anticipated Northern Ireland Protocol deal with the EU.
Yes.
So in this video, we'll take a look at what's actually contained within the deal, the controversies around some of the elements within it, and whether this could...
I love those emojis, guys.
...within the deal.
Really help me understand.
The controversies around some of the elements within...
Some people are angry.
...in it, and whether this could finally put the issue of Brexit to bed. For now.
Oh, TLDR, you are on it. You are on it with the graphics. Putting that PDF to bed, guys. Fucking love it. They literally put the Windsor Framework in bed.
The Windsor Framework formally means that the flow of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland will be split into a green lane, comprising of goods destined for Northern Ireland only, and a red lane, goods destined for the EU. The
way I understand it is Boris Johnson, basically, when we left the EU, he drew up this awful protocol where basically he put a big border in the Irish Sea between everyone in Britain and Northern Ireland. And that meant that everything that was going to Northern Ireland was going to have to be checked. It was basically like Northern Ireland was in the EU, but everything else wasn't. Because like Northern Ireland shares an actual land border with an EU country, for a very long time, they've had this very cushy situation where they can just, you know, transfer goods across this land border. It's mostly like perishable items that are the best things to be able to pass across land borders, because obviously you need to get perishable items across borders quicker, and if it's quicker to do that via land than it is via water, so their land border is very important to them, especially fruit and veg and for dairy and eggs and stuff. And basically what Boris Johnson came along and did was he protected that, but he made a really bad deal so that everything that was entering Northern Ireland from Britain had to be subject to checks. It was causing loads of admin and it slowed everything down, and everybody fucking hated it because it was the protocol was awful. And basically now Rishi Sunak's deal is he's basically saying, instead of having what's essentially a border in the sea where you have to check every product that's going across the sea because it might go into Ireland, what we will have instead of segregating, you know, the countries, what we'll do is we'll segregate the products. So if you sort of have products that you can promise will never go into the EU, that they'll never cross into Ireland, then they can be in the green lane and they don't have to be subject to checks. But the ones in the red lane are the ones that you're saying, okay, these might end up in the Republic of Ireland. They have to be subject to more checks, which is a better way of doing it. But still, the overarching issue here is still, it would have been a lot simpler and a lot better for us to have just fucking stayed in the EU. But anyway, let's carry on.
Some 1,700 pages of EU rules will no longer apply to Northern Ireland, narrowing the range of EU laws applicable in Northern Ireland to less than 3% according to the EU's own calculations, with those 3% of regulations being strictly necessary to maintain Northern Ireland's single market access.
That's a pretty fucking badass deal. To only have to abide by 3% of EU regulations is actually a pretty fucking badass deal. to get through. But at the same time, if the EU ever wants to introduce any new rules, then the EU still gets the final say on everything.
Well, firstly, on the matter of checks, while the green and red lane solution doesn't remove all checks, it does vastly reduce bureaucracy, and is a recognition, by the EU at least, that Northern Ireland is part of the UK, and thus ought to be treated as such. So, a broad tick for both sides on this one. The problem, though, is ECJ jurisdiction. Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, was at pains to stress that the European Court of Justice will remain the final arbiter of EU law. And while the UK government's command paper stresses that there's no ECJ jurisdiction over the Stormont break, the question of what role the ECJ will play when the Stormont break is deployed unjustly in the eyes of the EU is yet to be seen.
But basically, if Northern Ireland wanted to get goods from the UK, they don't have as many checks anymore. They used to have hundreds of customs forms if they wanted to get goods from England and Scotland and Wales. But they don't have to do that anymore with this new deal. Basically, with this new deal, Northern Ireland get the benefits of basically both being in the UK and being in the EU. And Rishi Sunak basically sold this deal to us as, you know, being able to like invest in Northern Ireland as this wonderful new hub where all of this wonderful trade can happen. But like, that's literally what the entirety of Great Britain had when we were in the EU before. But now just Northern Ireland has that because they have access to the EU through these, like, only having to abide by a few of the EU's regulations, and also they don't have to do all of these customs declarations anymore to get products from Great Britain either. So Northern Ireland are in a really good position now, but Great Britain as a whole could have just remained, you know, being in a great position that they were in before all of this happened in the first place. But let's not mention that. Let's not mention that. Let's just mention that Northern Ireland now are in a great position, and let's not mention the fact that Great Britain before Brexit was in that great position that Northern Ireland is in right now. Because he has got a good deal for Northern Ireland. But Brexit as a whole is a terrible deal for all of us. A very, very, very bad deal. So I'm gathering that Brexit is a clusterfuck? Yes. Yes, we've been through this on the stream. It's very much a clusterfuck. And it went through because of various reasons. Media illiteracy, financial illiteracy, and racism.
Broadly acceptable to both the EU and to his government. An agreement which hasn't been...
And Wetherspoons, you're absolutely right.
...possible on this issue.
The beer mats in Wetherspoons.
As you can clearly see, the stakes are very high for this new proposed deal. If accepted and welcomed in the coming days, Brexit could finally be done, and Sunak could see himself praised for a savvy political play. However, if opponents, even within his own party, decide that now is the moment to strike, that would exemplify quite how divided the Tories and the Union as a whole remain. And in that case, Sunak ought to be worried.
What was I going to do next? Oh yeah. Just this, like, brilliant clip of Rishi selling Brexit to Northern Ireland by basically saying that basically Northern Ireland will be what the entirety of Great Britain was before Brexit. This is how he's selling it.
If we get the executive back up and running here, Northern Ireland is in the unbelievably special position, unique position in the entire world, European continent, in having privileged access, not just to the UK home market, which is enormous, fifth biggest in the world, but also the European Union single market.
Oh!
Nobody else has that.
Oh, really?
No one.
Oh, yeah.
Only you guys. Only here.
No one has it anymore. You know why? You know why nobody has that anymore apart from Northern Ireland, who still has it in a kind of weird way now? It's because we left the EU.
And that is the prize. I can tell you, when I go around the world and talk to businesses, they know that. They're like, that's interesting. If you guys get this sorted, then we want to invest in Northern Ireland, because nowhere else does that exist. That's like the world's most exciting economic zone.
The world's most exciting economic zone is now Northern Ireland, because they basically now have all of the privileges that the entirety of Great Britain used to have. Should we look at Nigel Farage's take on the whole thing?
The absolute nub of this agreement, and whether it passes the fit and proper test is around the issue of sovereignty. Clearly, if a court in Strasbourg, if the European Union's own court in Strasbourg still has the final say, then Northern Ireland simply hasn't got Brexit in any recognisable way. Have a look at these exchanges.
I'm just going to point out that Northern Ireland also, they didn't vote for Brexit. It was like 55% Remain in Northern Ireland. They didn't vote for Brexit themselves. They're just having to deal with what the rest of the fucking Great Britain voted for.
Have a look at these exchanges and a question that was asked by the Irish broadcaster RTE about the continuing role of the European Court of Justice. And you'll see the response from Sunak, and then you'll see the response from Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. And make your minds up.
I think we all collectively share an ambition to avoid, as you say, a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that's why there's a role for EU law in Northern Ireland, but that happens with consent. And as a result of the agreements that we've reached today, there is further democratic accountability of that role of EU law with the new Stormont Break, which provides a very powerful mechanism providing reassurance to everyone in Northern Ireland that they are in control of their own destiny.
Yes, indeed, the European Court of Justice is the sole and ultimate arbiter of EU law. That's natural because it's prescribed by the EU legal order. So the ECJ will have the final say on EU law and single market issues.
Ursula von der Leyen makes perfectly clear that the European Court of Justice will be the final arbiter. The EU court will have the final say. And for me, that's why this so-called deal doesn't cut the mustard.
Do you expect us to fucking leave the EU and then for Britain to be able to say to the ECJ, oh, you should change this regulation and this regulation and this regulation, and now just do whatever the fuck we want? Is that what you fucking expected, Nigel? I thought you were all about sovereignty. Because guess what, Nigel? The ECJ also has sovereignty. It's not only the UK that has sovereignty. Other institutions have it as well. And sometimes these two nations both have sovereignty, need to work things out with each other. You can't leave an entire huge, powerful single market and then expect it to cater to your every fucking whim when it's bigger than you are. How fucking stupid do you have to be? This is what he's campaigned for his entire life, and he can't just accept that it was just a really fucking bad idea to begin with. But when you get into it that deep, you can't be like, oh, sorry guys, this was actually a pretty fucking bad idea, wasn't it? I remember when like the UKIP first became a thing. It was a long time ago, wasn't it? It was like over a decade ago when they first started sort of getting a little bit of clout in UK politics. I remember looking at this new party, UKIP. Who are these guys? These UKIP guys. I didn't barely know anything about them at the time. I looked at their manifesto and they didn't really seem to have any real policies apart from leave the EU. But that's not unusual for pressure parties, to be honest. You know, these fringe pressure parties that have one major policy that they really push for. It's not unusual for them to just have other policies that they have just to like fill up a manifesto because they'll never really truly get into power. They're a pressure party. So for a long time, they were getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and saying, we need to leave the EU because that's going to solve all of our problems. You know what it's like with late stage capitalism, people were getting exploited more and more and more and more over the years, and people wanted a tangible solution to the problems. And what we'd had for a very long time were like Labour and the Tories, and they were just consistently fighting over the same things, and it seemed like nothing ever really changed. And then UKIP came along and they had this one policy which was leave the EU, and it seemed tangible, a tangible change. But I think all of the people who were truly in power in Labour and the Tories, they didn't think that leaving the EU was ever a good idea. I don't think any of them thought it was a good idea. And it's not. It's quite clearly not a good idea. Our GDP is fucked now that we've left. It's fucked because of COVID, but like even worse because of Brexit. Nobody who's actually in power ever thought it was a good idea. The only reason Boris Johnson ever supported it was because he wanted to become Prime Minister. People in the Tories who supported Brexit only supported it because they wanted some sort of power. That's the only reason Boris Johnson ever ended up supporting it. There's footage of him saying that originally he was against Brexit. There's footage of him saying that he thinks being in the European Union is a really good thing and we should never leave. And then all of a sudden, as soon as he realised that maybe being a Brexiter could make him Prime Minister, all of a sudden he was like, oh, actually, I think this might be a really good idea. And so as UKIP got more and more power over the years, they became a bigger and bigger pressure party. They were all just, all of the politicians in UKIP were just outright racist pieces of shit. But they had this one big policy, which was leave the EU. And the Tories, who were in power, got more and more scared of them because they were losing votes to UKIP, because they were offering a tangible solution to a lot of people who were feeling extremely exploited by capitalism. It eventually got to the point where David Cameron was like, I'm going to have to do something about this pressure party. I'm going to have to make these UKIP people go away. And I'm going to do that by promising them a referendum on this whole leaving the EU thing. And then that will keep UKIP at bay. That will keep them away. And that will allow me to stay in power. And I don't think it will actually go through. I don't think we'll actually vote out, is what I think David Cameron thought. Obviously, that went wrong. We voted out because working class people in the UK had not been given any real solution. They hadn't, other than leave the EU. That was a tangible solution to the problems that they were facing. It wasn't the right one, but it was the only tangible one that seemed like it was going to make any real difference, because it was either that or deal with the same shit that we'd been having from Labour and the Tories for fucking decades. It was the only tangible solution. It was the wrong one, but it was the only tangible one that was going to make any real difference. And that's why it ended up happening. And now Nigel Farage, I think he's clever enough to realise that it was never a good idea in the first place, but he's still clinging on to it because it's helping him remain relevant at this point. But anyway, that's how we got in this mess. When we actually had to leave the EU in 2016, when they were all campaigning, when the people were campaigning, like the Leave campaign and the Remain campaign, were all fighting for their cause. Literally no one was fucking talking about Northern Ireland, from what I can remember. It just wasn't even part of the conversation. The conversation was full of Nigel Farage basically dog whistling racism. And I honestly believe that that's the reason that he won, because he was really good at dog whistling racism without actually outright saying racism. It came down in the end to like 1 million or 2 million people more voted to leave than to remain. You know that there's like a few million racist people in the UK are very easy to manipulate into voting out because they think that more brown people are in the country because of the free movement of people from the EU. You know that's what it came down to, eventually. Last year, from before Brexit, saying how much money we sent to the EU, what we'd be able to do if we left. That's also part of it, is just the financial illiteracy of not understanding why we send money to the EU and why we actually get more money out. And that's why we'd been doing it for so long. But people don't understand what an investment is. They don't fucking understand. Because in this stage of capitalism, we have rich people who get paid. People get paid just for having money. You get poor people who pay to be poor. You have to pay to be poor, and you get paid to be rich. That's how the wealth disparity gets so wide. That's why poor people don't understand finance. The rich people, they understand that because they understand that they can put money into a hedge fund consistently and get more out of it because they get paid to be rich. Whereas poor people, they see debt as a bad thing. So what they can do is they can pump out their propaganda saying, this country's in debt. We're sending loads of fucking money to the EU every fucking week. That means this country's in debt and we're eventually going to have to pay it back. And that propaganda works because poor people see that as a bad thing, not as an investment that we get more out of, but they see it as a thing that they're eventually going to have to pay back because that's how they see their own personal finances. Because at this stage of capitalism, what we've done is we've commoditized debt to poor people to a point where they've got everything on credit. They've got their house on credit. They've got their car on credit. They buy their TV on credit. They go into debt to buy everything and they're paying everything off monthly. And they see everything they buy as this thing that they have to eventually pay back. But what rich people are doing is investing money into things that they will eventually get more money out of. And that's how they understand finance. And that's how the EU works. That's how we were investing into the EU to eventually get more money out of it and to grow our GDP as a country. But poor people don't understand finance that way because they're not taught financial literacy, and also because of the system that we live under, we just force them to live in perpetual debt. More and more and more. They live paycheck to paycheck, and due to that, they get into debt. And it's absolutely necessary for them to make purchases that they have to pay off every month. That is debt that they're eventually going to have to pay back. That's not debt that they will eventually make money on and get money back on. That's just debt that they eventually have to pay back in the end. That's how poor people see debt. Rich people see debt in an entirely different way. They see it as an investment that they're going to make money out of. That's how they can get this propaganda out. That's how they can make it seem like being in the EU is a bad thing. And I think most people in power, like most people high up in politics and most people in the elite capitalists, I think they all saw that being in the EU was actually a good thing. But I think the reason that we ended up voting out is because people saw that it was a good way to get power, because they realized that so much propaganda had been pumped out via our tabloids that made people just be extremely racist and xenophobic, to the point that they realized that people were so hateful at this point that this was a good way to get power. It's a really easy way to get power, through hatred. And that's what they realized, that this is a good way to get power. So even though leaving the EU is probably not a good idea, I'm going to get power through doing it anyway, so I'm going to just fucking say, yeah, let's leave the EU. And I'm going to use that hatred, and I'm going to jump on that bandwagon of hatred, even though it's not good for the economy, and I know that. I didn't know Nigel Farage was going to send me off on such a fucking moon rant.
Barnier, Verhofstadt and the others deliberately used Northern Ireland to trap the British negotiators. They did it brilliantly, and we're living with the consequences. So you tell me, is the Windsor framework a win? Give me your views. Farage@gbnews.uk.
I know Nigel Farage is very financially illiterate because he attempted to start this business after the whole UKIP thing died. He attempted to become a financial advisor, basically, to help people invest in shit. He used to be a banker before he was a politician, right? He knows how this shit works. So he would have absolutely realised how us investing in the EU works. He fucking knows. Anyway.
Get your rats out! Normal rats like this. Normal rats like this. That's the normal rat.